This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
In which I'm sure I do several things that go directly against what Helen's just said, but hopefully that's a means for conversation rather than for anything else. Okay. At least according to those who invoked, referred to or represented it in letters both real and fictional, in lyric and poetry, in romance and prose fiction, how-to books and manuals on topics from painting to land surveying and firework making, paper in early modern England was possessed of considerable emotional range. A flurry of adjectives positioned paper and its effects as, among other things, happy, sweet, curious, presumptuous, reproachful, poor, cruel, dangerous, thirsty, rough, gross, rude and unworthy, sad, hard and cross, or fine and tender. These terms run the gamut of feeling in both senses, encompassing both strong passion and the practical experience of handling paper sheets. Several, of course, occupy an uneasy zone, blurring the distinction between that physical form and emotional content. So, for example, in 1612, Nicholas Britton told readers, "Good ink graceth the letter, but if the paper be naught, the pen will do no good." So naught is obviously describing physically paper which is rough and unresponsive, but since it means naughty and is commonly used as a term to describe children and bad behaviour as well, the term's evident resonances of deliberate malpractice or misbehaviour suggests also a certain determination on the part of the uncooperative substance, blurring the line between the emotion produced by the paper and the physical properties of the paper itself. The term sad is a resonant example. It means both a sombre mood, perhaps not our kind of distress and sadness, but certainly a kind of reflective melancholy, and a dark shade. When Albrecht Dürer in 1668 was translated his Art of Limning, it suggested that any would-be draftsman should provide yourself also a fine blue paper, some light-coloured, other some more sad, as also with paper of diverse other colours. And obviously for Dürer, this is a kind of technical description, but it means that when we look at something like Mary Sidney, writing about these dearest offerings of my heart in an elegy for her brother Sir Philip Sidney, we can see the kind of doubleness of her sad characters, indeed of simple love. Sad conjures not only sombre feeling, but the dark shades of Herbert's ink and page in a powerful rhetoric which harnesses the material presence of her tools. So much important work on the history of emotions, and some that we're about to hear, has drawn our attention to letters and their importance in kind of recording and expressing emotional states. Pollock argues that letters reveal the articulation of emotions, the dynamics of emotional engagement, and the role of emotions in interpersonal relationships. Weber and Alberti perhaps goes further in arguing persuasively that early modern love letters become a highly specific way of shaping as well as reflecting emotional experience, providing scripts for emotion, recording but also bringing into being certain modes of expression and hence structures of feeling. And his recent work on the material letter test by people like James Daybell, letters could also convey emotion through their material form as well as rhetorical content. So in Sally Holloway's paper yesterday, we had the lovely example of an 18th century lover promising to adore the papers, the ink, the very grease of your hand. I did think that was the grease of your love when I heard Sally yesterday, but I've checked it with her nice hand. In the early period too, there is a complex interplay between the traces, or sometimes the imagined traces, of embodied emotion and evidence of intense feeling, especially of course in the tracks of tears, which, carefully described, become a materially expressive means to convey the depths of a certain kind of feeling inarticulacy. So in 1615 we have Thomas Cullen's poem The Tears of Love, where a fictional shepherdess recalls her cruelty to her now deceased lover, lamenting pity he pleaded for with his soul and heart, and with much weeping prayed me ease his smart, for by the paper I might easily see that he did weep much when he wrote to me. It's kind of attempting, I don't know how effective it is, but it's attempting to produce a kind of emotional response in its reader at the same time as describing the emotional effect of writing. I'm conscious, of course, it would be dangerous to take this kind of literary representation as direct evidence of everyday or material practice, though there are some stained and potentially sad letters which survive in the archives. Even there, though, we might wonder about the extent to which material evidence could be also a kind of material device or material rhetoric, a kind of trope of feeling that's produced in material rather than necessarily kind of textual means. But I do think what this poem offers us is testament to the kind of hyperbolic construction of emotional affect that both draws on the terms of a culture of increasingly sentimental correspondence, and also helps to inform its terms and practices, So it keeps us, like so much else that I want to look at in this paper, on the kind of hinge between figurative and literal meaning, between poetic trope and papery effect. So 10 years later, in the next quotation here, William Brown deployed a very similar trait, using the relatively commonplace image of ink mingled with tears to suggest the physical transformations of written paper, turned from a late white sheet to a weed of mourning. Brown's repeated invocation of weeds, or of mourning clothing, is lent an additional resonance by the very widespread and equally poetically popular knowledge that paper was a product of fabric. So there are lots of poems, and also it's a very popular trope in sermons. The idea that paper is made of rags that are processed and brought together. And the image here is lifted directly from a brilliant article by Joshua Calhoun on the word-made flax about cheap Bible printing. But what you can see there is a shive, a little bit of the flax plant still very evident in the paper. And so it's something which is both kind of a cultural trope, this does get written about, but it's something which also is evident for readers in the pages of their text and in their material experience. So I want to pursue further the relationship between materiality and emotion as embodied and set in motion in and by paper, identifying and exploring moments when the material appears to participate in and be informed by structures of feeling and emotional response, and vice versa. The adjectival virtuosity surrounding paper in early modern England suggests not only how paper could stand in for and embody the feelings of its user, but that certain forms of emotion and memory were understood to be transferred to and inhere in paper. And throughout, I want to try and consider the kind of indistinction of the line between the metaphorical, paper as analogical or imaginative structure, and the literal, paper as a prompt and kind of informing trope of certain kinds of emotional regime. So famously, Edmund Husserl, not in the Renaissance, in his ideas pertaining to a pure phenomenology, brings into being the field which explores how we come to know the world around us from the familiar comfort of a writing desk. Husserl uses his meditative drift from the desk through the house and out into the garden as a means to define perception as an attentive perceiving, a shaping of the individual consciousness. I am turned towards the object, he says. For instance, the sheet of paper. I seize upon it as this existent here and now. The seizing upon is a singling out and seizing. Husserl's for instance, obviously here, is far from arbitrary. It is not a coincidence that paper is the example he takes, since it is paper that he is writing his thoughts upon. It's precisely the surface upon and with which he's working. And that's the kind of guiding way in which I want to think about how the perception of paper and an attentiveness, whether kind of overt or unconscious, to its presence, structures linguistic and metaphorical activity, and both prompts and embodies certain kinds of feeling. So writing as a physical activity could obviously prompt emotion. We've already seen that paper could be hard and cross, presumably capturing something of the response of the user. But it encouraged ebullient expression, as we'll see in a moment, but it would also be kind of more or less delightful as something to do. So in guides for how to make flourishes, for example, writing masters talk about getting a flying freedom of the hand, and this idea of a kind of liberation of the relationship between paper and its user. In 1632, using the meeting of nib and surface, that's Hannah Woolley, I've got my quotes mixed up, but anyway. In 1632, using the meeting of nib and surface as an analogy for the relationship between the preacher and his audience, Nehemiah Rogers reflected, respect must be had unto the auditory as the good penman hath in nibbing of his pen unto the kind of paper he writes upon, that it agree with it. Some hath a hard and cross grain, which soon takes off the edge of a tender pen. Here too much of the nib would not be left, the pen would be hard and dry. Some paper again hath a more fine and tender grain, with which the smaller pen does best agree. And so it's this example where the language of the physical structure of the paper again is the same as the language of emotion, suggesting that experience could be remembered and appropriated in moments of heightened emotion, that kind of relationship, but equally that the experience of material response could take on an emotional shading. And the quote that's here from Hannah Woolley also suggests a kind of enjoyment of fine paper in particular moments. So in The Gentlewoman's Companion of 1673, Woolley emphasises the need to create letters which delight the sight and don't tire the reading. And there's again this kind of continual attentiveness to the forms of paper and to its possibilities that recurs throughout this period. For many writers and commentators, though, paper is distinctly unemotional. It's a common trope to imagine paper as the archetype of unformed matter, ready for the imposition of a shaping form. So John Locke explained that he considered the gentleman's son whom he tutored only as white paper or wax to be moulded and fashioned as one pleases. And in Vidal de Dodidier's tragicomical history, translated into English in 1635, the title character Lysander, finding Hippolyta with a mind free and unpossessed, like a smooth white paper, writ in fiery letters the everlasting progress of his love. Later, S.N. boasted that my paper, whereon I am writing, receiveth the ink passively and bringeth nothing of it to the writing. Whence it followeth that those in whom God effectively will renew their will can make no resistance. Effectively will renew their will can make no resistance, as my paper cannot reject my writing. But there's a kind of, if we keep Husserl in mind, there's a kind of ironic moment here, in that arguably it's Essen's paper which is working upon and influencing this writer, informing his choice of trope and acting upon him, even whilst it's representing itself or being represented as passive and receptive. Parallel to this trope, we discover too the idea that paper is the ideal means to convey strong feeling precisely because it is in itself incapable of experiencing, or at least of physically expressing, the physical vitality of strong passion. So in 1621, Henry Eyre, apologising for his importunity in begging for a church living, described his own inquiry as a strange question, such as would make paper blush to bear as a question, were it capable of blushing. In 1640, Richard Brathwaite expressed a similar sentiment, explaining, "Let us know not how to blush, which caused them commit to paper what a bashful tongue could not so well deliver." So it's the idea that paper actually allows for a kind of greater emotional range precisely because it lacks a kind of physical expressiveness. But that's a trope which is complicated by the kind of rich heraldry of paper, of folding and of tying that we see in the evidence of material letters. And was expressed in 1671 in Margaret Cavendish's Nature's Picture, drawn by Fancy's pencil to the life, where white paper, and that's the quotation here, is made still more dazzling by the virginal worth of innocent love, and a modest mind is expressed precisely by the use of blush-coloured silk, so the blush is kind of materialised and bodied forth in the choice of the particular implements and tools. The material limits of paper could influence the formation and expressing of feeling, as of news and gossip. So writing to Jane Lady Bacon in 1629, Dorothy Randolph concluded a detailed letter saying, "Now my paper reminds me I have been so tedious to you and bids me to say no more, but that I am your most loving, faithful and humble servant." So there's a way in which, rather than presenting paper here as something which is just a kind of passive surface, Randolph, like many other writers, is seeing it as something with which she's in conversation, something his material form kind of restricts or prompts the kind of limits of her own expression. Equally, however, several commentators suggested that a blank sheet of paper might function precisely as a stimulus to emotional overflow, to excessive passion. So in 1638, a translation of the very popular letters of Jean-Louis Guez, Seigneur de Balzac, offered readers the example of a passionate writer declaring, "I can no longer hold from expressing my joy, nor keep my words from leaving my heart to fall upon this paper." Kind of really embodied sense of the writing moment that draws on only one understanding of the passions as physical as well as emotional states. So this is a kind of very richly embodied experience. The dynamic of the fullness of expression is carefully controlled in this kind of model letter, but there's a lingering sense too of the paper as a container or a recipient of emotion that can then be transferred along with the paper, and that's something again that we'll come back to. A poem by Diego de San Pietro again suggests the idea that feeling could not only be expressed upon, but in fact stimulated by paper. So here the snub speaker in the section in bold retires to a wardrobe to write. It's a much bigger room, obviously, and with different functions in this period, but retires to a wardrobe to write, and it's the moment at which he takes up pen and paper that the intensity of his feeling returns for really copious expression. So it's no, pen and paper I'd no sooner ta'en, but straightway I felt my former burning flame, that sense that it's kind of in the moment of preparing to write and seeing the paper before him that emotion returns and is stimulated. And as the poem goes on, there's really interesting attention to physical form, the idea that he folds his letter in pleats most small in order to drop it into the pocket of her gown unperceived and thereby effect his transmission. And that idea of kind of paper as something foldable, something portable, something that could be slipped into pockets, produced in bosoms, is again kind of a lively commonplace in the 16th and 17th centuries. There's a lovely example of Elizabeth Isham, a Nottinghamshire gentlewoman, who recorded in her diary that she found a loose paper of the Epistle of St. John. And that what she did was that I folded it up and made me a little book of it, and being very joyant of it, I kept it in my pocket. So Isham's practice of folding paper to create for herself a personal devotional book encourages us to conceive of the relationship between paper and its user, creating an object to be carried or slipped between clothes close to the skin. And Aisha's mother, in fact, gives her a precedent for this. So when she was feeling melancholy for a very long period, she would write herself little notes and then carry them about her person in order to kind of reflect upon them at particular moments. So Aisha's joy seems to come as much from the folding and the closeness of her little book and from her own ingenuity in creating it as it does from the comforting contents of this devotional text. Paper paper then, we might suggest, kind of carries emotion with it, or is certainly described as carrying emotion with it and becoming emotional in its mobility. It's a commonplace again that letters might convey thought and reduce the distance between absent friends. By paper, declares Michelle Mayer, one friend whispers himself in the ear and enjoys his distant soul at a distance. But some commentators did acknowledge the distance between expression and feeling. So William Warner, in the next item on the PowerPoint, complained that dead paper cannot weep nor wring the hands, but say that she did so. It can only kind of represent or remember emotion rather than embodying it. And he longs for the full adequacy of emotional expression that could be enacted in bodily posture and bodily effluvia. But for Charles Sackville, Earl of Dorset, the paper instead becomes an actor in an emotional exchange. Learning that his mistress is ill, he laments, "I could not forbear some passionate incivilities to the poor paper." You know, he takes out his emotional response upon the paper, which itself kind of becomes an actor in his transaction. And this again, it's a model letter, but I think it's kind of, I am moving kind of very possibly shadily or possibly kind of problematically between different types of source, but the idea that these model letters are actually providing possibilities of expression for other people to appropriate and use and reproduce, and the idea that they might also provoke kind of emotional responses to letters as proper ways to welcome and respond to and behave towards paper as it arrives. So I want to give a couple of examples of instances where the kind of heightened rhetoric of paper as bearer of emotion seems to suggest that either the emotion of the writer and or of the past material history of the paper seems to be understood to inhere in paper's subsequent incarnations and movements. The first comes from Thomas Southern's 1692 comedy, The Wives' Excuse, or Cuckolds Make Themselves, in which Ruffle hands over a fiery letter declaring, "There it is, make your best on it. The paper will make admirable crackers for a Lord Mayor's show. Every word in it as hot as gunpowder. I'm glad I've written it." Once invoking one small element of the rich material life of paper, it was a necessary ingredient in the manufacture of fireworks, as various how-to guides attest, Ruffle equally suggests the volatile heat of the words, which might, at this moment when the passions are understood as being as much bodily as psychic effects, produce choleric heat in the reader to match that of the writer, and also that the properties of the words might subtly inhere in the flammability of the paper. Thomas Randolph, in the poem on the left there, sorry, that's cutting off just a little bit at the edge, but Thomas Randolph flattered his own addressee by suggesting that it was the cleanness of his paper which demonstrated the worth and virtue of his words, concluding, "Contagious sins in which men take delight must needs infect the paper when they write," suggesting that kind of transfer of the character of the writer into the material of writing. And then in 1607 we have, this is not on the PowerPoint, but we have the example from Bussy d'Amboise, that d'Amboise, like a laurel put in fire, sparkled and spit, did much more than scorn, that his wrong should incense him so like chaff to go so soon out, and like lighted paper, approve his spirit at once both fire and ashes. So it's kind of a counterpart to this idea of paper, the words and the kind of physical history of paper being hot enough set it on fire, and the idea that the experience of watching paper burn might also be a trope to imagine the effects of choleric heat and the effects of sudden passion upon experience or upon the person feeling them. So a final example of this kind of trope, I've got Edward Cowley from The Guardian, in which Truman berates an unfortunate letter, describing it as an unhappy paper made of guilty linen, the monstrous relics of some lustful woman. Thy very ashes here will not be innocent, but fly about and hurt some chaste men's eyes. So we've already heard that this is a culture kind of attentive to flax and very aware that paper and cloth are very similar in their properties, and is brought out kind of in this really intriguing document in the history of disgust and kind of the foulness of women's bodily processes. That is as perceived, that's not why I proposed. The paper here embodies its material past and bears that history forward into an imagined future as ash, so the paper's unhappy trajectory is both determined by its material history and by its emotional content. And while Truman again is thinking figuratively, this is a moment in a staged play, although in terms that invoke the commonplace physical continuity between paper and cloth, I want to close this paper by moving to some meaningful paper that gains its emotional effects in the absence of words. So this is kind of skipping over and cherry picking. I've been doing some slightly perverse research with someone in the English department of finding out all the ways in which paper was being used in early modern England that weren't about writing. And it's trying to take just a kind of sample of those examples and of a very clear attention to paper as something with particular properties. It can be folded, it can be creased, it can be cut, it can be moulded, and it possesses very particular operations that make it useful in a very wide variety of practices and purposes. And there's not time to begin to trace anything like all of them now, but in a kind of handful of examples, I want to suggest some of the ways in which paper might provoke emotional response without being implicated in writing or without being actually part of this kind of description of emotional content. So in his highly influential study of lies, Tim Ingold declares it is not enough to regard the surface as a taken for granted backdrop for the lies that are inscribed upon it, which does beg the question why he called his book Lies rather than Surfaces. But as flexible, foldable surface, paper also possessed a series of emotional resonances that I want to trace briefly here. So we've got an advert, for example, from 1700, and this is at the end of a book, so it's paper within a book which is advertising other uses and other means of paper, other meanings of paper. It tells readers that at the Bible in Gracechurch Street, alongside a wealth of books and printed material, you may be supplied with paper hangings of the newest India and Japan figures, either by yard or sheet, very delightful for rooms or closets. And it's worth, I think, unpicking a little bit the emotion of delight, this kind of temperate emotion of enjoyment and appreciation and aesthetic response, in which repetitive decoration produces paper as an overt declarative surface which is engaged in shaping the emotional response to the home at this moment. As a little aside, paper was frequently used not only in cooking, but in medicine. It's used for bandages, it's used for making medicines, it's used for all sorts of kind of medical, physical purposes. And when it's burnt, for example, one commentator recognises that pieces of it are lighted in a room, it can actually cure extreme emotion. So as well as spots, if you have pimples, paper is also very good for them. But pieces of it lighted in a room, hysterical women are made to receive the fume of it. They are commonly relieved with this disagreeable smell. So there's kind of exploitation of paper's physical qualities as a means to relieve extreme emotion. But beyond these uses, paper might also invoke the ludic pleasures of childhood. So William Petty approved of children's paper toys, unlike many educators. He recommended, as part of a proposal for educational reform written in the mid-17th century, that it would be more profitable for boys to, quote, spend 10 or 12 years in the study of things than in a rabble of words. Petty suggests that learning is made easier and pleasanter by allowing children to pursue the natural propensions they delight in, since they have quick senses to receive them. And these propensions included practicing juggling and card tricks, but also making ships with paper, making spinning tops and whirligigs from paper, and making pictures in their writing books. So it's kind of bringing into view an entirely ephemeral world of paper play. These objects don't survive, but evidently there were paper birds, paper kites, paper lanterns, paper ships, kind of occupying the streets and the rivers of early modern England. And I'm interested in trying to think through how far the pleasures of creating these childish toys might inhere in later experiences of paper, impleting a letter into tiny folds, as we saw earlier, and enjoying the kinds of satisfaction of the fold, the crease, the formation of paper into particular shapes. There's a lovely moment in the Countess of Montgomery's Urania where Lady Mary Roth, describes the distress of a character. Unguided she was, unruled and unmanned, tumbling up and down like the boats boys make of paper and play withal upon little brooks. So it's evident that what Roth is doing is kind of foregrounding a gender difference. Her character is not one of the little boys who has played with boats, but at the same time she's suggesting how paper play might provide structures by which to describe and hence experience passionate feeling at different moments in the life cycle. Paper might also, and finally, be something wonderful. It was quite literally part of the contents of the Cabinet of Curiosities, whether labelling, supporting or enclosing artefacts, or indeed displayed as an object itself worthy of wonder. So various collections do have different papers from across the sea, from different countries, and different objects used as paper collected within them. But there's also Nehemiah Grew's description for the Royal Society of a forest with a house at the end of it and several beasts, both wild and tame, as the lion, unicorn, boar, camel, stag, and a dog pursuing him, all cut in paper in the compass of about 3 inches square. That's what he describes one of the natural and artificial rarities belonging to the Royal Society in 1685. So it is an object in a Cabinet of Curiosities. And women's paper cutting is also a kind of moment at which there are masses of poems, which I want to look at in more detail, but a whole group of poetic responses to women's ability in paper cutting emerging at the end of the 16th and beginning of the 17th century, and this idea of the kind of fineness of paper as a material that can be manipulated in these ways. So at moments, paper enters the realm of the curiosity or marvel. It reminds us of Francis Bacon's assertion that all knowledge and wonder, which is the seed of knowledge, is an impression of pleasure in itself. And the image I've got on this slide is from a set of instructions on how to make something called a trouble wit. and this is when you take a sheet of paper and pleat it finely, and then he says you can make up to 16 different shapes of it, and he tells you how to fold it in order to create them, and then kind of runs out of energy and says, you can work out the rest yourself. But it's the trouble wit is something that's kind of there in terms of, I think, troubling our wits about the factual presence of paper and the ways in which it can be made to mean and express different kinds of delight, wonder and puzzlement at the same moment. A 1649 collection of natural and artificial conclusions, with a new edition of rarities for the practice of sundry artificers, as also to recreate wits withal of vacant times, offered, amongst other diverting experiments, instructions to make of paper a bird, frog or other artificial creature to creep on the ground, flee or run upon a wall or post. It instructed readers to take a piece of paper and cut it with a knife or scissors into the form of the figure before, or whatever you please, then take a little piece of wax, pitch or other glutinous stuff, and on the back side where you see the letter A, place it. Then warm it at the fire and stick thereon a fly, beetle or what other such small voluble creature you shall think fit, and you shall hereupon behold a very pretty conceited motion, with content sufficient and a kind of pleasant admiration. And obviously there's a moment at which only modern emotion seems particularly strange to us, the kind of concept of delight at seeing a fly stuck to a piece of paper and beating against the wall. But the text title language of the natural and artificial, as of rarities in the work of artificers, places this horrid hybrid in the realm of curiosity and wonder, and teases at the distinction between the natural and artificial, as the panicked buzzing of the fly or beetle becomes a remarkable mechanism of the paper marvel. The characteristically horrid jest is undoubtedly far removed from the adjectival and metaphorical description of feeling that I opened with, and that's such a commonplace of a range of Renaissance genres. But I hope it does begin to open up a sense of the ways in which paper as a substance folded, creased, transformed, written upon and distributed might prompt emotions as diverse as wonder, awe, puzzlement and childish joy. Brought into conversation with that popular trope of paper as expressive and as something which could not only convey emotion but be transformed into it, perhaps they also suggest that curious paper might not only stimulate feeling but be understood to participate in and even feel the richness of emotional life.